Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We start a bit later. The schedule has been pushed a little bit, so we decided to start. Thanks for those who made it into the room already. Let me start with thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to host this event at this session, and also Jean-Paul from the UNECA for co-hosting this event here in Windhoek. Maybe a quick I was going to give you a short background as to what the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative is all about. Then I'm going to give a bit of a background, and then we're going to move into the speakers. I will not take more than 5 minutes. So background on our initiative. The Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative is a time-limited initiative, which is ending by the end of next year, 2023. We have a mission which is to seek the catalyzation of governance on carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification, otherwise referred to also as climate altering techniques or geoengineering. We are impartial on the outcomes of these governance processes. We are not for, not against. We are just concerned that governance, in the broader definition of governance, has to start and has to start now. And we'll see through speakers' interventions that this is necessary. We have a long history of engaging with the Economic Commission for Africa and the African Union Commission on the subject matter. It dates back to the 7th edition of this conference. Back then, we started raising awareness on these what is referred to carbon dioxide removal techniques. The 1.5 special report from IPCC was just out. It reaffirmed the findings of the 5th assessment report of IPCC, which was very clear that transformative action has to happen now, actually yesterday, with regard to not only emission reductions, but also the need to develop societal acceptable carbon dioxide removal techniques in order to reach net zero around mid-century, which is about 20 plus years, and then to remove carbon, the excess carbon from the atmosphere thereafter, which is net negative emissions. This is actually reflected and got the political support and commitment to that by governments in the Paris Agreement under the UNFCCC process, which basically commits them to temperature goals, reaching net zero and net negative thereafter. The briefing which we did back then was about awareness raising of that subject matter, which was not yet known, had not sunk in, and about the interrelations between these techniques and sustainable development, and to help beginning sharing and African conversations around that. That was the partnership's idea in terms of having the first briefing events back then. But even in that context of science telling us that it's needed, political commitment that it is needed, it was really very controversial to engage into conversations around carbon dioxide removal. The context has changed a little bit, and I want to just take 2 minutes on the change of context before we move into the agenda. There's a change in what IPCC tells us about the pathways towards these temperature goals. Back in with the special report of 1.5, the pathways all allowed us to reach 1.5 still. There were pathways which reached 1.5 with no risks of going beyond that temperature. That has changed. The 6th assessment report, the working groups which just came out, and we hear more about this by one of the presentation, are clear that there is currently no pathway which will not, for a period of time, exceed that temperature goal before reaching the 1.5, which is called overshoot. Which, to be very clear, this does not mean that we cannot be ambitious enough, and we have to be ambitious enough to have pathways which will still be below 1.5, but there is a risk that we are not successful by now. There's no pathway without risk, but achievement is still possible, and that's what this conference is all about, what the conference in Cairo is about, and what the overall work towards achieving development under the climate change constraints is all about. That's why it is so important that governance, the way IPCC and we understand it, is that is all the process become aware of a problem, begin a conversation, learn, exchange, discuss, and at the end there is rulemaking by governments. Sometimes rulemaking has to be an upfront to set a frame for a conversation, but the core is that this is something which has to stand. And the good news is that since the 7th edition of this conference is that actually that has begun. As I said, achieving net zero is part of a declared policy and action commitment in the net zero commitments very clear. Governments and nations are moving towards that. Companies are moving towards that. So that is happening. So that part of governance is beginning. Some countries are even have even national determined indices. Just the indices, you're familiar with the abbreviations, to achieve net negative before 2050, for example, Finland, and put this into their law. So even the later aspect of removing carbon in large quantities, carbon dioxide removal, is reaching that. The Article 6, you have sessions around this. Article 6, which is about project-based or otherwise based collaboration between countries on removals, among other things, has asked for methodologies. A long way of saying that basically governance on carbon dioxide removal has happening. And this event is about how does these techniques, these technologies and techniques relate to the development, just transition, energy, the various things Africa is grappling with. This event is about sharing that. So it's part of contribution to this governance around that. In order to do so, we have the vice chair of IPCC, Thelma Krug from Brazil, who is unfortunately not possible to join us in person in the end. We will have a recording of hers, which is giving us the science background, a bit more depth to what I said before in terms of where we stand, followed by interventions of James Mwangi, Sheikh Silla from Senegal, and others, and yourself, sharing what the current state of thinking is around carbon dioxide removal in the context of development in Africa. And with this, I will move ahead and ask my colleague to share the presentation by Thelma Krug, please.
Good afternoon to all, and it's really a pleasure to be here, and I thank the organizers for the invitation. Okay, so my presentation, being the first one, is intended to set the scene for the presentations to follow. And it's supported by the material from the IPCC report during this 6th cycle. Next slide, Alia, please. So for the presentations for a scene during, yes, thank you. For the presentations for a scene during this event, overshoot pathways are of particular importance to the approach to be discussed. So IPCC defines temperature overshoot as a temporary exceedance of a specific level of global warming, say 1.5 degrees Celsius, that then returns to that level or below it before the end of a specified period of time, say 2100. So temperature overshoot substantially increases the risk of release to the atmosphere of carbon stored in the biosphere due to the increased wildfires, tree mortality, insect and pest outbreaks, peatland drying, and permafrost thaw, for instance. So this slide shows different pathways assessed by the IPCC for the special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, including some with no or limited overshoot that are shown in blue, and others with high overshoot that are shown in gray. So lots of different scenarios that lead us to the limiting global warming to 1.5 at the end of the century, but some with overshoot and some without overshoot. So this report of 2018, this special report on global warming of 1.5, found that if warming continued at the rates then assessed, global warming would cross 1.5 degrees Celsius between 2030 and 2052. However, with the release of the Working Group 1 report last year in August, that looks at warming projected for various emission scenarios, global warming is projected to reach or exceed 1.5 in the near term, 2021 to 2040, even for the very low greenhouse gas emission scenario that I will now introduce. Next slide, Alia, please. So the IPCC Working Group 1 considers a set of 5 illustrative scenarios shown on the left of this slide, and that covers the range of possible future development of anthropogenic drivers of climate change that were found in the literature. They start in 2015 and then include scenarios with high and very high emissions, which are the red ones on the top, a scenario with intermediate emissions, shown in yellow, and then scenarios with low and very low emissions, which are shown on the bottom in the blue color. So on the right, what you see is the change in global surface temperature in the long term, say 2081 to 2100, relative to pre-industrial times, indicating that for the intermediate scenario, for instance, shown in the yellow bars, the best estimate is 2.8 degrees Celsius, and the largest contributor being CO2 emissions for all the emission scenarios. Next slide. This next slide shows the very likely, between 90 to 100% probability of the increase in the global surface temperature over the period 2081 to 2100 for the 5 emission scenarios. For the intermediate scenarios, for instance, the range is 2.1 to 3.5 degrees Celsius, and the best estimate, as we have seen in the previous slide, being 2.8 degrees Celsius. This is informative for all the scenarios, and also IPCC addresses for all near term, medium term, and long term. I am addressing only the long term here. So next slide. So we know that many changes in the climate system so many changes in the climate system become larger. I don't know if this is the light, the correct order. Ali, can you show the next one? Yes, and then we might need to come back. So many changes in the climate system become larger in direct relation to increasing global warming. So it's very likely, 90 to 100% probability, that heavy precipitation events will intensify and become more frequent in most regions. Also, mid-latitude and semi-arid regions and the South American monsoon region projected to see the highest increase in the temperature of the hottest day, of about 1.5 to 2 times the rate of global warming. And in the Arctic, for instance, it's likely to be practically sea ice free in September, at least once before 2050, and this is under the 5 scenarios that have been considered. So we come to the previous one, Danelia, please. Yes, sorry for that. So the burning question is, are we on track to meet the Paris Agreement temperature goals by the end of the century? So this is an important question, I would say. And then if we look at this slide, it shows in red the projected greenhouse gas emissions in line with policies implemented until the end of 2020 and extended with comparable ambition levels beyond 2030. So the light blue color that you see, it's the first one at the bottom, is associated with pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with no or limited overshoot. When we say limited overshoot, we're talking about 0.1 degrees Celsius above 1.5, and assume immediate action after 2020. So without a strengthening of policies beyond those that are implemented by the end of 2020, greenhouse gas emissions are projected to rise beyond 2025, leading to a median global warming of 3.2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Hence, presently, we are definitely not on track. So the Working Group 2 report released the last months assesses that if global warming transiently exceeds or temporarily exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius, then many human and natural systems will face additional severe risks compared to remaining below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And depending on the magnitude and duration of the overshoot, Some impacts will cause the release of additional greenhouse gases, and some will be irreversible, even if global warming is reduced. So the next one, Elia, please. So this, the next one, yes, thank you. So the previous one. Yes, thank you. So this next slide shows on the left the global surface temperature changes relative to pre-industrial levels projected for 4 emission scenarios, from low to very high emissions, the ones that we have seen already. And on the right, the IPCC so-called reasons for concern framework that communicates the scientific understanding about accrual of risk for 5 broad categories, including extreme weather events, which is the second one, RCF2, and large-scale singular events, RFC5. The purple color indicates high risk, and the 4 dots that you see alongside the colors indicate the confidence level, and 4 dots being very high confidence level. So we see that even at the level of temperature that we have today, 1.1, you have unique and endangered systems already being impacted. The next one. The report of Working Group 2 also includes examples of regional key risks based on the magnitude of adverse consequences, such as perversiveness of the consequences, degree of change, irreversibility of consequences, among other factors. So additional warming, for instance, above 1.5 during an overshoot period this century will result in irreversible impacts on certain ecosystems with low resilience, such as polar, mountain, and coastal ecosystems, impacted by ice sheet, glacier melt, or by accelerating and higher committed sea level rise. Next one. Yes, thank you. So when I provided the definition of overshoot at the beginning of my presentation, it was indicated that a temporary exceedance of temperature would return to or be below a specified global warming level before the end of a specified period of time. So in order to achieve this, carbon dioxide removal, CDR options, would be required to reduce the atmospheric concentration of CO2 to bring global temperature back down. And to achieve this temperature reduction, the amount of CO2 drawn out of the atmosphere would need to be greater than the amount entering the atmosphere, resulting in a net negative emissions that I'm sure the next speakers will address. So the larger the overshoot, the more net negative CO2 emissions are required to return temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And one point that I would like to highlight is that risks may arise from some responses that are intended to reduce the risks of climate change, including risks of maladaptation and adverse side effects of some emission reductions and carbon dioxide removal measures. For instance, the deployment of afforestation, that is one of the CDR options, in naturally unforested land or poorly implemented bioenergy can compound climate-related risks to biodiversity, water and food security, and also livelihoods, especially if implemented at large scale and in regions with insecure land tenure. And then the last slide. And then a different approach than CDR, since it would not stop atmospheric CO2 concentrations from increasing, is solar radiation modification, SRM, which the literature only supports as a supplement to deep mitigation, for instance, overshoot scenarios. The approaches have the potential to offset warming and reduce some of the global risks of climate change related to temperature rise, sea ice loss, and frequency of extreme storms and heat waves in some regions. But large uncertainties and knowledge gaps exist in relation to technological maturity, physical understanding, potential impacts, and challenges of governance that may constrain the ability to implement SRM in the near future. So, coming to the end of my presentation, I would like to summarize in 5 bullet points. First one, unless there are immediate large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 will be beyond reach. Second bullet, even with rapid emission reductions, warming can be limited to near 1.6 degrees Celsius at its peak, so with an overshoot of 0.1 degrees Celsius, returning to 1.5 degrees Celsius or below by 2100. Third bullet, with this overshoot, it's expected that more frequent and intense extreme events, higher global mean temperatures, and potential irreversible risks to non-resilient ecosystems might occur. Fourth bullet, even with emission pathways with no or limited overshoot, CDR approaches are needed. And finally, SRM approaches might be an option to cope with the risk of impacts from hazardous events, but brings with it other potential risks. So with this, I hope that I have given a broad overview that I'm sure the presenters that will come after me will explore at much more depth. Thank you very much.
Okay, let me say thank you to Thelma, even though she's not present, for this introduction. With no further ado, first of all, our colleague from the African Union Commission is not yet here. She's, I think, going to join soon. I'm not so sure with the circumstances. So I would suggest that we move right away to the next presenter. His name is James Mwangi. Some of you may know him. He's the founder of the Climate Action Platform for Africa and the executive director of the Dalberg Group, a global collective of impact-driven businesses that are working to build a more inclusive and sustainable world. James has been spearheading and working a lot in the space of how can CDR offer opportunities for sustainable growth and development in Africa. James was with us on a very good internet connection, but I think that died down to him, but I think he connected via phone, if I'm not mistaken. So James, thanks for joining us. Over to you. James, you seem to be on mute on your side.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, fantastic. Yes, my apologies again. I was on a good connection, and then there seems to have been an issue with my fiber. My apologies also for missing part of the conversation. And thank you for the invitation. I will, because I cannot, I don't have video and so on, I will try to be brief and maybe respond later to verbal cues. But I think the previous presentation did a very good job of kind of outlining one of the two halves of what I see as the climate narrative, certainly as relates to Africa, which is that climate change is a real, severe, and imminent threat. Many of the actions currently locked in or planned are compounding that threat. That threat will be particularly felt heavily in Africa for two reasons. One is our geography, and we heard why in terms of where some of the biggest effects will be felt. But second is our demography, which is sometimes missed, because if climate change is a crime of past generations against future generations, then the center, the central place where that crime will be felt is the youngest continent on Earth, because we have the highest concentration of future lives and the lowest concentration of current and previous lives relative to the challenge. And so in that way, the first half of this, climate change is real, impending, and pressing and demands action. It's clear. I think where I have focused my work is, or where my thinking has focused, is on the second piece, which is the opportunity for Africa to play a critical role in climate action. And by that, we mean the activities that will be, and the changes, some of which were alluded to in the previous presentation, that will be necessary to avoid the very worst disasters for humanity. And this is around the questions of reducing and avoiding emissions, expanding and protecting various natural resources. And finally, in a focused way, if we are heading for overshoot, investing in substantial carbon dioxide removal and climate restoration. Each of these are going to be increasingly important activities. Some of them admittedly do not yet have a clear business model and thus a business case. But it is fair to assume that but it is also true that many of them do, and many others will in the coming years as some of the effects and challenges that were outlined become clearer. Now, my own entry point into this conversation was the question of jobs. For most of the last 20 years, my work at Dalberg has been really focused on how do you boost youth employment in Africa, whether that is through fostering private sector investment, focusing on creating more skills, looking at policies to grow various industries. Sorry, my apologies. Can you hear me?
We hear you again, yes.
Yes, my apologies for that. So I think I was saying my focus has been on the question of jobs and job creation in Africa. And from that perspective, we argue that Africa has three assets that give it a particular competitive advantage when looking at the needs of climate action. Those three assets are a large growing workforce, which we talk about as either a climate or rather a demographic dividend or a demographic bomb. We have ample land and natural resources, and we have large endowments of potential renewable energy, so untapped renewable energy. Importantly, we also don't have that much by way of highly emitting infrastructure today. And that opens up three pathways for the continent. The first is ensuring that Africa is green from the start, not because it is somehow our obligation above others, although we are a major beneficiary from slowing down climate change, but because it probably makes economic sense in many spaces where we're not fully baking in the implications of technology leapfrog. So how do you ensure that Africa's consumption and production industries are built with the most sustainable modern technologies baked in? Whether it is really maximizing the share of renewable energy within our energy systems. And here, I know that people may debate whether that is 100% renewable or there's a role for some gas, et cetera, but I think the basic point is to say we are very far away from the ceiling of how much renewable energy Africa can generate and use, and we should get to that ceiling as quickly as possible. So that's the first thing. But then also rethinking things like how do we construct our cities, how do we transport ourselves, and so on. To give you a sense, many times, many African conversations begin by us saying, as a continent, we contribute very little to current global emissions, something like between 3 and 6% of global emissions, depending on how you think of certain land use related effects. And that is true. But by 2050, a business as usual trajectory, taking Africa's economic growth and population growth into account, but by 2050, a set of assumptions taking our growth in population and growth in economies into account suggests that Africa would account for something like 12 billion tons of new emissions per annum if we go with business as usual. Now, as was noted earlier, the world cannot take this, and the first place to be hit by the bad effects of overshooting in this way would be Africa. So we need to look at another path, but that path is economically attractive. So the first point is green from the start, whether it is in our energy systems, in our construction systems. 40% of new construction globally is going to be in Africa. If we can green construction from the start in cost competitive ways that has climate benefits, and so on. The second opportunity is producing for the world. And here my argument is that because Africa has the least level of carbon intensity in our economies today. If we maintain that while adding energy and adding productive capacity, that becomes a comparative advantage in attracting a whole range of industries, arguing essentially that Africa is the lowest emitting or least emitting destination for production. And that is across a range of areas, ranging from the already growing calls for green hydrogen on the continent, which presents a huge set of opportunities, but also other energy-dense sectors that could make use of our vast untapped renewable energy potential. And that both creates jobs and attracts investment into the continent. And the third area, which I've spoken about elsewhere at length about, is the whole question of carbon removal and climate restoration. Whether this is through the protection and expansion of Africa's natural carbon sinks, the expansion of their capacity through activities such as the deployment of biochar and other hybrid solutions, or the deployment of some of our renewable energy and other natural resources such as our geothermal basalts in the East African Rift towards being the place where we actually scale up large-scale carbon removal and sequestration. Now, none of these things are by any means being proposed as things that Africa does for free or indeed pays for itself. Rather, there are areas where new activity that will need to be paid for in various ways is actually best done in Africa, and are thus new competitive industries where Africa should be competing for comparative advantage. And so thinking about how we can position various parts of the continent around the business case for leapfrogging to green technologies from the start, whether it's in things like e-mobility, renewable energy, and so on and so forth. Rethinking how we position Africa as a desired production destination for global export because of our lower carbon footprint. And finally, leaning into the question of how do we better capture value from our role as a carbon sink, whether it's through the current carbon credit markets or other mechanisms that make sure that Africa's role as a potential savior in balancing the carbon books is recognized and incentivized. All of these together have the potential to shift Africa from being a hapless climate victim to being a critical part of the climate vanguard, and telling our next generation, currently stuck in usually relatively hopeless situations, that they have a clear mission, a purpose, and a role in the world around being the generation that not only brings Africa into middle income status and beyond, but in doing so and through doing so, brings the world and our global ecology into some degree of climate balance. Now, I'll pause there. Each of these points, of course, raise a whole range of detailed questions. We may not have time for them in this conversation, but I would just note that there is the detail around how each of these mechanisms might work that could be of interest to the participants. Some of it available at www.capa.org. Over.
Thank you, James, for this intervention full of thoughts and call for imagination and thinking differently and positively about the challenges ahead, how to convert them into something of that nature. I would like to turn now to Sheikh Silla, who is the Director of Cabinet at the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development of Senegal. He has been a long-term negotiator for Senegal. I think I was still having no white hair and gray hair when I met him first time. But he's a very young and dynamic person. So he will intervene in French, as far as I understand. So in case you might need your translation system. And thanks again for the translators doing a great job back there. Thank you very much. So Sheikh Silla, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kai. Good morning or good afternoon, where we are in the world. And it's my pleasure to participate and thank you for inviting me. I will address first of all in French and after in English. We have conducted two kind of studies in Africa. One in September 2020, and I will highlight the possible element for resolution. And this on the geoengineering that we wanted to address to INEA 5.2, but that was not successful. And we had also another African workshop in Nairobi in 13-14 January 2022 to prepare the African Minister Conference on Environment with regards to geoengineering. And I will come back later on this during the Dakar meeting. Now I speak in French for the element possible for resolution. La CATM est aujourd'hui citée comme une alternative pour lutter contre le réchauffement climatique. Et il s'agit d'un ensemble de technologies complexes dont nous n'avons pas encore la maîtrise complète de ses conséquences, positives ou négatives, au niveau local, régional, international. Et j'ai bien suivi les deux présentations qui sont excellentes de PCC, bon, suivi aussi du professeur. Ce sont deux présentations sur lesquelles je ne vais pas revenir sur l'essence, mais moi, je vais me mettre dans une perspective africaine par rapport à ça. L'Afrique a donc plus à gagner qu'à perdre en prenant les devants et en jouant le rôle central dans la recherche, la gouvernance et les décisions dans ce domaine. Tout d'abord, il est nécessaire de créer un espace transparent et équitable pour la participation de l'Afrique aux discussions et à l'élaboration de résolutions dans le cadre des organes des Nations Unies. Et les éléments clés de la résolution seraient notamment les suivants. Je les cite. Premièrement, les capacités et les limites pour comprendre et gouverner les activités de géo-ingénierie en Afrique devraient être soulignées avec la nécessité d'assurer la responsabilité et la transparence dans toutes les activités liées à la géo-ingénierie. Deuxièmement, il est essentiel d'établir un dialogue avec toutes les parties prenantes en Afrique, en particulier avec les chercheurs et les scientifiques africains et autres, les universitaires, les instituts de formation, les organisations non gouvernementales et le secteur privé en Afrique. Et il est aussi nécessaire d'éviter la recherche et le déploiement à part entière des technologies de la géo-ingénierie sans une connaissance sûre et commencer par des essais de recherche dans les zones confinées. Troisièmement, lancer des essais au niveau régional pour évaluer la capacité de ces technologies à lutter contre le réchauffement climatique, parce qu'on n'est pas encore sûr de toutes les certitudes, et en même temps mesurer leurs conséquences sur les cycles de sécheresse dans le Sahel, par exemple, l'agriculture ou tout autre domaine pertinent afin d'obtenir davantage de preuves scientifiques. Quatrièmement, avec le groupe de négociateurs africains, la possibilité de porter cette question au niveau des cadres pertinents tels que les organes de la Convention sur l'ozone et de la Convention sur les changements climatiques. Le GIEC aussi est un organe statutaire qui pouvait fournir une analyse approfondie des technologies de la géo-ingénierie et de leur implication en termes d'utilisation pour les humains et les écosystèmes. Ces rapports sont remarquablement influents dans l'élaboration des politiques en matière de changement climatique et c'est pourquoi le GIEC doit évaluer de manière approfondie les capacités et les limites de la géo-ingénierie pour réduire le changement climatique et gérer ses risques. Enfin, on devait soumettre à l'UNEA la possibilité de mettre en place un comité intergouvernemental de négociation pour prendre une décision finale sur la CTM. Maintenant, quand nous avons fini cette réunion avec le document africain dont je viens de faire la synthèse, we had the meeting in Nairobi, 13 and 14 January 2022, and the summary of key messages and highlights are: the African Climate Change Group of Negotiators met in hybrid format in Nairobi on January to begin creating awareness on the risk, impact, opportunities, and also implications for Africa of geoengineering technology. In the discussion, participants highlight that, first of all, Africa is deeply concerned that current level of global ambition and commitment to address the global climate change crisis are insufficient and will not limit global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And this results in severe impact on an African continent that is already extremely vulnerable and with the least capacity to adapt to climate impact. Third, bullet, that the potential impact of geoengineering CDR and SRM technologies will add a further burden on a continent already experiencing climate change and its impact. The second concern is Africa is further concerned that the geoengineering CDR and SRM technology, in terms of current state of knowledge, will have potentially severe transboundary impact and implication across multiple sectors and area of legal jurisdiction. Given the global and transboundary nature of this potential impact, it is important for any concern related to this technology to be considered by relevant mandated bodies within the UN system involving all African countries. It's like AMCEN, at scientific, technical, administrative, political, and legal levels. And the last bullet point, Africa further is also extremely concerned that the focus on financing experimentation with and studies on this technology, largely in developed countries, will result in countries shying away from their UNFCCC obligation to implement and finance mainstream proven policies, technologies, and measures to achieve actual and real reduction in global greenhouse emission at sources and the building of resilience and adaptive capacity, particularly in developing countries. There is also some two other highlights. Additionally, Africa is concerned that the focus on negotiating a governance system for the emerging CDR and SRM technologies will take time and potentially further divert political will and resources away from obligation to implement and finance proven technology. In the light of this concern and high degrees of uncertainty around the technology, Africa should not support their application at this stage, but should rather support the development of an authoritative scientific synthesis and review of the state of knowledge of the technology, assessment of their potential benefit, costs, risk, impact, and other implications. These scientific assessments should be conducted by a mandated body such as the IPCC with a view to informing any possible international policy debate and science and risk-based international management of potential implications if necessary. While recognizing the importance of international control to prevent unilateral advancement of geoengineering technology and that ensures African concerns are fully addressed, pending an authoritative review of the current state of knowledge of this technology, as well as the need for further capacity building and consolidation. Africa is not yet ready to support any engagement on possible broader international governance matter related to this technology, given the above mentioned. So first of all, limited level of understanding, and second, considering that existing bodies within the UN system have the mandate to address any immediate geoengineering concerns that may arise. And that is the highlight of that we have during our Nairobi meeting. And third action we have developed in Africa is based on the study prepared. This meeting we had in Nairobi, we put ahead all these documents to the African negotiation on climate to come back with a view of Africa, what decision Africa have to take with this geoengineering. And during the AMCEN meeting, this one, the geoengineering have been put in the agenda, but unfortunately, the African group of negotiators didn't finalize the decision for Africa, and we put it in other matter, and it's remained in the agenda for next AMCEN meeting, and that will be after the COP. It's likely that Africa don't want to open it this in the COP, but at least to continue exploring the way to have an African recommendation with regards to the technology. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shixila. This brings us, I think, is the colleague from the AUC? No, I think they didn't make it. Anyhow, so I think then we are basically moving to our Q&A session. Maybe I'm not so sure about the people who are coming from the internet, how we will find out whether there are questions, but maybe first in the room, any questions you might have or comments for that matter? It's a conversation, so please feel free to raise your hand. I know it takes one to move the village. Yes, thank you very much. Great, I get some exercise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Dion Shikuza with the Namibian Youth on Renewable Energy NGO. My first question is, how is the Center for Technology and Climate Network supporting the agenda that we are discussing here? And are there any possibilities? Because if we are to develop any technology of this kind, I would assume CTCN will play a big role in ensuring this context, ensuring that the technology has relevance to the deployment areas we want to take it, and also ensuring that the transfer of the technologies not burdening the developing countries in terms of cost. Then the other question was intellectual property rights. How do they play a card and a role here, and the standards in terms of, do we have international standards as to what's the best technology we are looking at in the area of climate restoration or alternative energy capturing methods? So I think my question was more on CTCN, the intellectual property rights. Do we have the way we have with the Nagoya Protocol, where we have access to equal and benefit sharing to ensure that all natural resources are equally shared and the communities from which they come also benefit? Do we have something like that for this type of technology? And how can we ensure that there is that fair balance? Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Haduyu Michael from Africa Youth Commission. And I must say that when I walked in, I didn't know what was being discussed, but I don't regret coming, because governance systems is something that we must understand so that we can be able to move forward. And I'm so glad for the speakers, especially the Mwangi, who was giving about the opportunities that are still within Africa, and that we need to leverage on. And he mentioned something interesting about green construction that has climate benefits. I don't know if he's still online to answer that, or somebody can answer within the room. When you talk of green technologies, green construction, what exactly are you talking about? Is it green buildings? Is it architectural modeling that are compliant to the climate change agenda? Then I just want to know, what is the governance systems agenda at COP27 moving forward? Because for those who will be going to COP, so that we can start tracking it and also understand how we can make it part of our things that will be following up at the COP. And finally, and this is I think this might have been inspired by the first presenter. Africa, we've not been engaging so well with IPCC. Thank God we are making some progress. We now have our chapter 9 was dedicated to Africa and all those things. I just need to know, how are you planning to engage in AR7? And do you have, because I saw the first presenter was really loaded when it comes to in working group 3 outcomes and the report outcomes. How are you planning to engage with the assessment report, or how are you taking these AR6, how has it informed your work moving forward to AR6, and how can we be engaged as young people within the continent? Thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions. Just maybe before we go to answering them, is there someone from the ether, from the virtual space, who has some questions? Not for the moment. Okay, again, I don't know how we want to go about answering. Maybe I start with the one which was very concrete and specific from the last to James. Maybe if we could just quickly react to the green construction questions, and then I'll circle back to the other questions. So maybe with this one first. And if you have some thoughts with regard to the other two, please go ahead as well while you have the mic. James, we don't hear you. You know, while you, is it okay?
Hello, I was trying to unmute, but having trouble too. Sorry to come in. Please go on.
Yes, please go ahead. So the question about what is green constructions? How do you get green construction?
I think there's a couple of different pathways to green construction. The first is we can look at the materials for construction. And if we agree that Africa, well, so the underlying fact and a dominant fact for me is realizing that between now and 2050, 40% of the world's urban construction, 40% is going to be in Africa. Back in the 90s, when people talked about the future of cities, they were looking at places like Chicago and saying, well, how will these evolve? But actually the future of cities was being determined in places like Shanghai and Mumbai and elsewhere. And Singapore and so on. And I think similarly today, we look east when we think about the future of cities, but a lot of the new city development that's going to happen and a lot of the new urban development and evolution that's going to happen is going to be in Africa. So with that, there's aspects of city construction that are going to be hard to shift. We're going to need massive quantities in all likelihood of steel and cement. And so one pathway to green construction is rethinking the carbon intensity and the role of carbon in these areas. So for example, when you think about cement, we can think about ways to capture the emissions from the production, massive production of cement from the beginning, and there's technologies that allow for that. And then importantly, how we use concrete to sequester carbon dioxide, so that actually we're using our built environment to sequester carbon. And again, those technologies are coming along that move concrete construction from necessarily being hugely emitting to potentially being carbon neutral and maybe even carbon negative. Similarly, there's a question of what other materials we could use. And here, technologies such as using cross-laminated timber, where if we have a sustainable supply chain around timber, where we are replacing what we are using, then using timber to a greater degree in our construction increases the amount of carbon that's permanently stored away. Because remember, every tree that dies and is not used is going to go up into the air as a combination of methane and carbon dioxide when it burns, versus if we can use some of that to construct using modern techniques and at a large scale in our built environment, where it can stay locked away for decades, and in some cases even centuries. And again, a lot of research and development is going into that, looking at, what might new technologies that allow us to go relatively high using primarily cross-laminated timber and wood frame construction, what might those technologies entail? And so the challenge for us is how do we open our minds and not just copy the designs that made sense last century and in other geographies, but actually go back to some of the ways that we use other materials here in Africa, but modernize that to make our construction at a minimum carbon neutral and ideally carbon negative. To give you a sense of the potential, I think when we modeled it, we identified about 10 to 15 gigatons of additional emissions possible related to Africa's construction. But if, for example, you had half of that pivot to carbon neutral and carbon negative technology such as cross-laminated timber, you could actually end up with a negative 5 gigaton impact of African construction. In other words, the growth of African cities would actually be making the problem less rather than worse. It's not easy, it's only theoretically possible, but the technologies and scientific approaches are out there that we could understand and deploy in a range of environments across the continent.
Thank you, James. Then maybe, Sila, do you have any reactions to the question about who develops these techniques? Oh, sorry, you had to move on. Okay. Well, that doesn't give me many options to answer your questions. Maybe I should try it from what I think gather from the questions. So, and Jean-Paul, you help me with that, please, huh? Because you know the continent for sure much better than I do. Now, on the question of who develops the technologies, I think the question is really complicated because you have a wide spread of techniques and technologies which can remove carbon. If we're talking about this basket of technologies, right? The carbon dioxide removal baskets, and they're either completely technology based, so the IP is very clear. Then there are more soft IPs, probably in the nature based or in these hybrid solutions, and then there are ocean based ones, right? So the answer is not. So that's very clear. Second one, I wasn't quite sure what center you were referring to. So there is the CTCN. Yeah, that's the one which is the UNFCCC kind of created, mandated, context-driven collaboration space on technologies. As far as I understand, they actually decided this year early on that they will actually develop a working stream on carbon dioxide removal. What specifically, unfortunately, I do not know the detail, but if you go on the website, it was decided. We had talks to them like 2.5 years ago, and they were like saying, oh, we don't touch this. But it is, the science tells us, and the way we are advancing our ambition is telling us we can't avoid these kind of conversations. And then I think I will also react to the IPCC's AR7 question, which I think you had, is that, so there have been attempts by some governments to actually have, this is now on the questions of solar radiation modification and how solar radiation modification can or cannot be a means to mitigate or work with this, I call this the residual risk of overshooting the temperature. By how much and how long depends on how good we are in emission reductions and carbon dioxide removal implementation. Here they have asked whether one could have a special report or workshop event by IPCC, and or whether it can be included in the IPCC 7th assessment report. As far as I know, there's nothing been formally decided, and also the seventh assessment cycle has a certain delay. But what I also know is that if you talk, for example, to Roberto Schäfer, and you can look him up in one of our what we call C2G talks on our website, he was the person leading the work on finding the pathways, if I may say so. He was very clear in his answer, saying that AR6 was the last assessment report which had actually 1.5 pathways which they could construct based on scenarios. He says that the next round will probably include solar radiation modification in order to achieve 1.5, but whether or not this is happening, he can't tell, we can't tell, right? But this is basically from his perspective of where we are, where we're heading, comparing forecasts with implementation. He says it will not be possible within the next 7 years to not have that conversation, and most likely research and science will have provided input to IPCC, which is like gathering what we know, right? It's not really doing proactive research in per se. So it is finding its way most likely, but it basically depends on governments' courage, readiness, and willingness to task IPCC with looking into these subject matters stronger than they did for the 6th assessment report in light of where we are heading. But maybe you have additional thoughts, Jean-Paul, or some additional thinking in any case.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Kai, first of all, for the excellent answers and also the fantastic questions. I will approach it from a slightly different angle. I will look at it from the economic angle and building on the intervention by James. Because if we look at carbon removal in the African context, obviously Africa currently is the least contributing towards carbon dioxide emissions globally. But in terms of what the future economy will look like, here I'm talking both the African economy and the global economy. And how do we prepare African countries for that context? And how do we actually situate African countries in a format whereby they can take advantage of whatever decisions that may be taken at the global level, but I would say even be proactive in terms of deciding what technologies are most conducive for African countries based on their existing resources. So if we look at firstly, the aspect of nature-based removal, Africa has a huge opportunity. But carbon markets currently, there is not a global carbon market which is effective. There are voluntary markets that African countries could make use of, but currently African countries are generally getting a lower price. There are different reasons for this, but one of the key issues going forward would be if we want to develop Africa's capacity for carbon credit markets, it should be about the integrity of that market, and really allowing African countries to play the role that they could theoretically play, because the work that we did with CAPE, ECA, we saw that just using nature-based removal, Africa can meet 30% of the whole world's sequestration need by 2050. But Africa should be paid for that. We're not going to sequester it for free. And it should be at a rate which is not $10 per ton or lower. It should be at a rate which recognizes the fact that we are likely to overshoot, recognizes the fact that this will have huge costs across the world, and this can be an opportunity to actually use investments that we would do anyway, because if we're going to invest in agriculture, if we're going to invest in job creation, and a lot of the work we've done with CAPE has shown that there is a direct link. If we invest in the right sectors on the nature-based side, we will get a good return on investment, and in addition, you can from the carbon credits. On the technological side, this would appear upfront to be more of a cost from the perspective of African countries, because we don't own these technologies, at least very few at the outset. But there are a number of African countries that are already very engaged in fossil fuel exports, for example, and these are big parts of the economy for these countries. And it will be essential when we look at just energy transition plans that countries factor in what will be all of the methodologies that they can use. And it's not about emission reduction necessarily for Africa, but it is about ensuring that it's not the first item on the agenda. The first item on the agenda is connecting people to electricity. But by doing so, by connecting people to electricity, we can ensure that African countries are using the most efficient and effective mechanism. So I think elements like solar array modification and similar technologies, while they may not be of immediate priority for African countries, it will be essential that African countries are in a position to know about these technologies and to look at them relative to their own pathways in terms of investing in energy production as well as in decarbonization, and having clear requests in terms of the type of technologies that they think that they will use, and putting that in a context which is looking at the efficiency of the economy overall. So I think the economic argument for carbon removal for Africa around nature is quite obvious. On other technologies with the right markets, and for example, if through the African Continental Free Trade Area, we were to establish, let's say, a mechanism for internal trading of carbon credits within the continent, then even these technological solutions might become viable and be incentivized, perhaps not so much the solar array modifications, but around the implementation of existing fossil fuel technologies in our countries. I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, questions?
Thank you. So thank you very much, Kai, and thanks also to the presenters and to JP for the point that is bringing into the conversation. For me, I sort of really got involved in thinking about carbon capture and storage and use technologies. Back in 2019, Kai, after you introduced this topic in CCDA then, and immediately following that meeting in Nairobi, we went to COP in Madrid. And one of the things that struck me in Madrid is that, in fact, there were several panels that were discussing carbon capture. And in one of those panels, I got to learn that by 2019 already, trillions of dollars had been spent in developing technologies, but also in deploying technologies, in addition to the money that is already going into nature-based carbon capture, which is an extension of the REDD+ initiatives. But since 2019, which is 4 or 5 years ago, uh, the IPCC sixth assessment report has been published. And that sixth assessment report actually indicates a dramatic increase in carbon concentrations in the atmosphere, and particularly even a greater increase post-COVID as economies are recovered. And this begs the question of, if trillions of dollars had already been spent in these technologies by 2019, how do we understand the impacts of those technologies? Independently, I think, of the economics of investment in carbon capture and use technologies. But the second question, which is, I think, for me, a debate that continues from the CCD in Nairobi, was the concern about the efficacy or the potential implications of some of the technologies in terms of weather modification. There is a very real sort of concern in Africa that firstly, we do not have the policy or legal environment to regulate the adoption and deployment of these technologies. But secondly, also that we do not have the technological capability to detect the potential impact of those technologies on our own, on the global climate system, but also on our own weather systems as well. And I've not seen any evidence in the interim to actually sort of begin to address these policy concerns. This is to say, and our initial position then in 2019 was, we cannot ignore the fact that this is a major development that is happening, but we need to inform African governments and assist to develop an appropriate policy response to these technologies. Otherwise, we'll be left behind, right? So if it's an investment opportunity, and if there are economic opportunities, how do we ensure that these are equitably distributed and that carbon capture does not become another of those technologies which marginalizes the continent? Thank you.
Jean-Paul, you might have also a reaction, but I let me react. So in the historic perspective, I will start actually with whatever you said is what I think drives our mission. Our mission is not to give necessarily the answers, but these questions you have need answers, because as IPCC is very clear, the science is clear, is that we need to remove the carbon out of the atmosphere, which we have emitted already beforehand. So conversations of, if profits have been made, where did they go? If we implement certain activities locally, what are the side benefits, risks, and impacts? How do we deal this? How they're integrated in the famous price of carbon when we are, selling or when we are trading on this in that space? And that's what we would refer to as the need for governance. So that's on the, maybe a quick reaction on the CDR space, is that that's something which, from our initiative, we have come back and provided opportunity to converse, but priorities, I think, drive people of where to focus on, and also a certain level of rejection to engage into this conversation. Because, I mean, my white hair comes maybe also from the fact I'm nearly 30 years in this space. And I started, it was a conversation of adding some windmills and hydroelectric power into some grids of developed nations, if I really simplify the matter, and leadership shown by those countries. And now I find myself 30 years later to talk about a likelihood higher than not that we cannot even make 1.5 anymore. And 1.5 is already a recognition of condemning many peoples. And I don't have to explain this to you guys here. In other places I may have. Having condemned people to migration, death, and very, very, very difficult livelihoods. So it's not a lightly comment of saying, oh, we are going to go to 1.6. And we do not want to understand how we get there, how we secure this, how we manage this risk of overshooting. So that is the responsibility. We want to catalyze that policymakers and everyone begins to internalize that as a motivation to engage, to understand, and to have the conversations and find answers to the questions. Because if we do not find answers to the questions of how are we going to remove the carbon, either through kind of systems where finance is driven by an emission reduction I can't reduce, or even by we just remove it. We have to remove it. So that's one space. And I think, Jean-Paul, you might have answers of how to get there and how to do this part. As regards the questions of solar radiation modification, which I think is very important. That's why we went away from this, as an initiative, went away from this reference of using the word geoengineering. Because geoengineering is a term which basically puts carbon dioxide removal, which is a clear element of mitigating against the cause of climate change. And is part of the UNFCCC convention, and it's just gotten to a scale which is unimaginable. While solar radiation modification, which is like a band-aid, which you apply, in order to protect yourself against further harm, fundamentally. And we heard the references by Telma Krug of what are the additional 0.1 impacts depending on duration and so forth. So hence, again, the question, when to engage. And then comes, I come now to your weather modification conversation, which is always a kind of a, so it has this effect of weather modification is typically done in order to trigger rain, in order to get it where your location rather than to the neighbors. And that's where the problems begin and start. And there is but that is basically considered still a weather intervention, but not a climate intervention, because it modifies the weather locally. There are, however, solar radiation modification techniques which are on the borderline. For example, what is called marine cloud brightening, where the idea is to basically spray salt into the sky in order to make clouds more condensed and whiter. They reflect more, so the space below becomes cooler. Then in a small scale, probably, again, just a neighbor impact kind of thing. But experiments are going on at a large scale in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef. So that's the extent, in order to see how weather modification can actually protect the economic and ecosystem zone vital for the region of Australia. So it's that which is driving them, and making there the difference between weather modification and the legal environment for that is actually something where, again, governance is needed. The recognition, it's there, it's recognition, it's being used. Do we have some regulation around this? Let me start. Do we understand it? What do we need to further understand? And so forth. So I could probably keep going more and more, but I know that Jean-Paul wants to come in with his reaction as well. So.
Thanks very much. I think that we have to focus on what are the immediate needs of African countries, and the immediate needs are energy access in particular. And the reality of pursuing those needs based on current technologies means that African emissions will actually increase, right? Based on current technologies. There is not, things may change very quickly. Green hydrogen might completely change the game, but based on, if we were to today use existing technologies to achieve, let's say, 100% access for African citizens, we would dramatically increase emissions, even if the majority of that access could be done through renewables. It would still be a very sizable increase on the continent, even if globally, percentage-wise, it would actually be very small, but it would still be a significant increase in those emissions. So I think in terms of the technological solutions, it's really about African countries planning the energy transformation, not necessarily transition, but the transformation that we want to see in the continent. And what this will mean, for example, in terms of the emissions and how we want to manage those emissions. In the majority of nationally determined contributions that African countries have made, we tend to say we need X amount of investment to be able to invest in renewable energy. And there is not necessarily and of course, there's a lot of variation in these NDCs, but have we really linked the ambition that we would have for our economies with the mitigation plans that we have, or even the adaptation plans? And I think the focus should really be on having an economic transformation plan, which includes an understanding of how this contributes towards the commitments that we have already made in the context of the Paris Agreement. And as much as possible, and I think James was very strong on this, we will find a large number of those interventions which are going to reduce emissions, including around energy access, will actually be also giving us the best return on investment, and will actually make Africa more competitive. If we look at the fossil fuels, the current scenario on fossil fuels on the continent, large number of countries that are exporting fossil fuels still are not reaping the real benefit from fossil fuels, partly because there is not enough value addition, there is not a supply chain and sustainable value chain around those emissions, around that production. And also, in many cases, we subsidize that fossil fuel production using the very limited tax revenue that already exists on the continent. So if we were to be very rational, looking even at the existing generation capacity, we will see that the transition will actually probably provide more jobs, and it will provide a faster rate of growth. Certainly in terms of the work that ECA has done, we have seen that if we were to invest in green sectors more generally, which includes energy production, it includes climate smart agriculture, and it includes nature-based solutions, we can get up to 420% more gross value addition. Because by doing that type of investment, you will tend to get more value addition in the value chain, as opposed to just investing, let's say, in fossil fuels for exports or extraction of resources for export. And I think in terms of those plans that African countries will put forward, it's about then understanding what are there are some countries that are going to be in a scenario because they've already, let's say, invested very significantly in fossil fuels, where they will continue to have emissions. And they will need to look at what are the appropriate technologies that will be useful for them. And then I think we have to link this as well with the capacity on the continent for research. So where there can be even solutions that are grounded within the capacity that we have within the continent. And I think really link that to the needs that we have. Thanks.
Thank you. I think James, I'll get back to you. And then James, the other James, which is online, he hold a second. Let's have James react, and then you may probably catch up a reaction also to his question. So James locally to James virtual. This is the order.
Thank you. And James virtual, hope you are doing well there. It's James Morombezi here. So I have a follow-up.
Good to hear your voice, James.
Yeah, so I have a follow-up question precisely on the investment points that JP is raising, which I think are now very pertinent in and probably are beginning to define the climate response. The whole climate response now is basically now about how do you actually create investment opportunities and ensure that you mobilize private capital to respond to this challenge. Before lunch, we were having a discussion about waste management. And someone raised the point that creating investment opportunities around waste management, which is a form of pollution, is like privatizing a public problem. And they're calling for, well, why don't we ensure that we have sufficient public policies to address public problems, even if those public policies are designed to guide private investment. Now, if we take that argument to the atmosphere, carbon dioxide is basically an externality of the production processes that have been employed since 200 some years ago. But the polluter pays principle has basically been abandoned in favor of everyone has a contribution to make. So all of our nationally determined contributions and so on are about what we can do and perhaps also mobilize our own resources to respond to that challenge. Now, this is a real contradiction because I think technologies now also make it possible to identify the sources of pollution. And could we not, instead of thinking of carbon extraction technologies as a form of investment, could we not actually link those as to the costs that are being externalized by the producers of carbon, and actually getting them to invest in removing that carbon, than creating an opportunity for new investors to come and extract? In other words, should public policies really be designed towards creating a new destination for capital investment, or should we not actually create or develop public policies which internalize the cost of producing carbon currently, but also historically?
James Mwangi, if you want to react, and then I have another question in the back, and I might comment, and then Jean-Paul can wrap up, because I think we are running it towards the end of the. Maybe first James, and then I go.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Good. So I actually think, James, that we're actually very well aligned, because I agree very much that the future has to be polluter pays. But polluter pays does not mean polluter cleans. It means that the polluter provides. Beg your pardon? Sorry. Polluter pays doesn't mean polluter cleans. It means that polluter provides money that goes into a market that allows a business that is focused on waste management to exist, thrive, and scale. And I think what we're saying here is that firstly, if we are to see a real market for carbon removal, it will have to come from in some way charging carbon emissions. That's the logical place that this goes to. It's the future of a well-functioning carbon market is those who emit will pay and those who remove will be paid from the balance generated. Where investors come in is investing in the capacity. Just as today, you can get private equity money to set up a waste management company in a private waste management company or an industrial cleanup company somewhere. The investment is in building the capacity that will then be paid for by the polluter. Today, polluter pays means nothing because even if they give away money, what is it being used for? The damage is already done. If we can get these technologies to the point where the damage can at least be partially undone, it allows for a viable market to emerge. And it's a market where potentially, because Africa has so little emissions to its name, we will be paying relatively little, while because we have a lot of removal capacity, we could be extracting a fair amount of value in return. Over.
Thank you, James. Gentleman in the back, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Chabi Joda. Really brilliant exchanges. I just wanted to comment a little on the maybe a rather nuanced approach to some of these conversations that most often do not look at the other stakeholders who are the local communities in terms of understanding their stakes, their thoughts, and the risk that they bear when all this interaction is going on, and even including the policy frameworks that we're talking about. Where is their stake in this? And we are moving forward with the transitions, which are expected to really be transformative, green, and sustainable. But I am afraid that we might be leaving some people behind. So I'll be very glad if you share with me, how can we connect these dots so that these last mile stakeholders are not really left behind? And then just a question again, I want to ask my dear friend, James Morumbedzi, that also there is this ongoing conversation around renewables. Are we really taking into consideration the amount of land degradation that is involved in the sourcing and exploitation? I don't know if that word is the right word, but in the absence of a proper word, the exploitation as a collection of these resources, the primary resources, how much emissions do they constitute and how much risk do they constitute? Because we are also trying to look at that issue of natural occurring radioactive materials that are being generated through the process of exploration and exploitation that has often very harmful, radioactive substances on those very local communities. So I just want to see the decency side of these processes and how can we enhance that in a way. And then thirdly, just to say that it would be very nice for our partners to perhaps consider that our governments need to hear a new language around the issues of social justice, which is very important. The rule of law, very important. The absence of corruption, it's very important because the rules, especially right now with new emergence or emerging challenges, especially like in the Sahel where I'm working most often with state fragility, where you are getting more and more armed groups emerging from different spheres and occupying the spaces of natural resource control. And as we are planning, perhaps decently on one side, there is this there are these activities taking place on the other side of it. So I was just maybe bringing a nuance. That's why I mentioned just some nuanced thoughts around some of this so that we can understand, especially how much does social justice plays in these roles, in these systems, and how should we package this for governments to understand that as much as we need to really put these frameworks into practice and getting them towards the push for emissions reduction, there is that need for people who are working on the front line, for people who are living in these different value chains to have a sense of social cohesion, which is very important for the thriving of every society. No productive society can survive without peace. And so with reference to the incidents in the Sahel ongoing right now, I really want to hear from you. What are your thoughts about how you think we can go forward with these side by side, or what is the way to prevail over these already maybe almost prevailing circumstances? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now have a very pertinent intervention. So I lost, James, did you have also your hand up? I was not sure anymore. No?
Well, not really, but just a sort of a brief response to the point that Tabi makes about the potential impacts of climate actions on local livelihoods, on land, and so on. And I believe JP would have a better response than me. But for instance, in nature-based solutions, one of the most important considerations are, in fact, the governance considerations, which would explore the implications, let's say, of implementing carbon sequestration in, let's say, forested lands. And then the questions become, well, what are the land tenure systems? How are current modes of access regulated, mediated, and how would the intervention itself affect those, but also affect livelihoods, particularly of potentially marginalized stakeholders like women and the children. And I believe that the same considerations are also taking into account in designing and implementing large-scale solar-based or other sort of interventions that seek to support carbon capture there. But that would be my response. Thanks, Tabi.
Thank you. In which case, I think we're running actually slightly over. So James, over to you for your concluding remarks and maybe reaction to some of the interventions at the end. I am done. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Kai. I would like to start. Oh, James, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't know which James was being referred to. I don't know if I had the floor or not. My apologies. I've got really bad reception, so bear with me. I was just going to offer one very quick reflection, which is I think the social economic questions being raised and the social political questions being raised are central. And to my mind, the thing we all need as African decision makers to accept is that part of the challenge we're facing is a systemic and multifactorial that is driven and compounded by climate change, but which might actually be partially solved by climate action. In other words, part of the way that we address the question of a lack of jobs is to create real flows of value for ecological stewardship that then allows us to actually get people from the gun to the land as we try and boost that, the amount of carbon captured in African communities and so on and so forth. So it's both about the mass scale kind of effort to better, to improve Africa's standing in the global carbon economy. It's about, to the other James's point, making sure that the polluter pays principle is well captured in the way that we structure our carbon markets for the future. And then it is about determining the methods, both labor intensive, such as biochar and others, as well as technology and capital intensive, such as direct air capture and others, that Africa may be competitive in. And by competitive, I mean just that, to attract both capital and income to drive these new industries of the future that have as an additional benefit the kinds of climate challenges causing some of the instability there. It's thinking about this all as one challenge and finding ways to both maximize jobs in
increase the prospects for direct investment, grow the opportunity for new technology development, and lean into the economy of the future rather than the economy of the past.
Thanks a lot, James. We towards the end, we lost you a little bit, but thank you for those really, I think, insightful comments, and which I think have helped us to better situate how we would like to see or how we can conceptualize carbon dioxide removal in the African context. So it's my responsibility to just say some very brief closing remarks. I would like to start by thanking all of the panelists, all of the speakers. I think you have all given us an absolutely fantastic insight into the question and situated it as well within the particular context of Africa. I would like to thank our partners C2G for having organized this event, and of course, all of the partners of CCDA and of ClimDev. In terms of some of the key considerations, firstly, in the context of COP27, we are going into a negotiation where those that have contributed the most to climate change are likely to be resistant to further put resources on the table or even to push forward an additional ambition. This is potentially disastrous for the planet, but is particularly disastrous also for Africa, which is the continent perhaps the most affected by climate change. And even in terms of warming, because warming has not been uniform, I think in parts of the continent, we're already seeing increases of temperature in excess of 1 degree. In some places, I believe 1.8 degrees. So the impacts and the ability to respond to these changes in Africa are very significant. The principles, of course, are that the burden should lie on those that have historically emitted. But the context of our discussion today has also been how African countries can modernize their economies and move towards models of economic transformation, whereby low emissions trajectories are actually not only pursued for the purposes of reducing emissions, but rather as being optimal in the context of the value addition and impact that these pathways can create. Africa is certainly very well situated in relation to nature-based removal strategies. And in terms of technological strategies, it is important that the appropriate understanding is present across the continent, that appropriate efforts are made to invest in research that is compatible with the African continent, and that we actively consider frameworks, including, for example, through carbon credit frameworks that can further incentivize the move towards low emissions development trajectories. We have noted the relative challenges for these issues to be integrated within Africa, but partly because of lack of capacity and lack of investment, particularly in the technological aspects. But in conclusion, I would like us to consider carbon dioxide removal strategies, perhaps through three levels. Firstly, there is the global level situated within the COP and the UNFCCC process, where the goal has to be the continued reduction in emissions, and in particular that we do not overshoot the temperature goal because of the dire consequences. And there has to be a very strong narrative from African countries of how that will be achieved. The emphasis, of course, being on those that have contributed the most towards that impact, but recognizing that if we do overshoot, the impact will be felt the most by Africa, and therefore it is important that there are strategies in place to make sure that we are in line with these temperature targets. Secondly, I would speak of the opportunity for a regional perspective. By having, and I think a few people have spoken about governance issues, and there is an opportunity through, for example, mechanisms developed by the African Union, or through the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which can allow us to incentivize, again, low carbon development and, for example, move away from subsidies of fossil fuels, and thereby also situate Africa very clearly in the context of carbon dioxide removal and potentially also monetizing this carbon dioxide removal. And then thirdly, of course, at the national level, where individual countries are encouraged not only through their nationally determined contributions, but in the context of COP27, there will be a move towards just energy transition platforms, where countries can look very specifically at their industrialization needs, their needs in terms of access to energy, and look at the most appropriate technologies which would be needed in the context of their development, which would allow them first and foremost to fully achieve their development goals, but also do so in a format which is aligned with the goals that we have all set ourselves through the Paris Agreement. So thank you very much once again. Kai, you have been a fantastic moderator, and to all of the participants, thank you very much.